National Service have decided in this season of emancipation to fully examine the subject of emancipation. And to this end, we have invited Mr. Trevor Marshall to deliver this lecture, The Road to Freedom. I now invite Mr. Marshall to the podium.
Okay. Well, good morning, good afternoon, whatever time of the day this is being telecast, videotaped. First of all, thank you, Miss Archer, Deputy Director of the National Library, for inviting me to give this lecture. Through Mr. Adamson, once again, thank you. I recognize Mrs. Paris and Mr. John Downs as senior members of the National Library Service. Thank you very much for having me. My pleasure and honor to deliver this lecture. And it is entitled The Road to Freedom. The Road to Freedom. And we're looking at Barbados. And by freedom we mean the emancipation of 1833, 34, 38. Now let us get clear one point. In Barbados at 1830, which is nearly 200 years ago, the society was totally different from what it is today. Barbados had a population of approximately 83,000 persons, of whom 80,000 were enslaved. They were descended from Africans who had been captured in the Senegambia region and brought to this island over a period from 1627 up to 1807. They were unrepresented at all levels of society. They lived on the farms, which we call plantations, sugar growing plantations, sugar producing plantations. And their lives were ruled over by what we would today call oligarchs. We've heard that word used in relation to Russia. And basically, an oligarch, the Greek word oligoi, the few, arche, rule. An oligarch is one of the few persons who had total control and rulership over various and large groupings in society. In this case, the Barbadian black population on various estates. Barbadian enslaved persons were on about 500 estates, from the north in St. Lucie to Inchmarlow in Christchurch. There were mainly agricultural workers, that is, workers in the cane. And as the folk song said, they cut sugar cane till it burned their hands. Most men, adult men, were working in the sugar cane as machete-wielding cutters of cane. And there were also the persons who used forks and other implements to prepare the land. So the work that harrows and tractors, rotavators do today was all done manually by adult males. Adult females loaded the canes onto mule and bullock carts, and teenagers also did work. There was also child labor. In Barbados, every child 6 years and older worked, every black child. They were introduced to what we would today call the social forms of labor. They were introduced to the plantation at age 6, and they worked from then until whenever they died on the plantations. Other blacks worked in the towns, Bridgetown, Oistins, Old Town, and Speightstown, doing odd jobs, carrying to and fro, but they were all enslaved. Family life was more or less controlled by the planters who were in Parliament, who were what we call an omnibus aristocracy. They controlled Parliament. No blacks could vote. No blacks could stand for Parliament. Right. Only whites. And the voting level was set at 25 years old as a white male, and ownership of property was one of the conditions. In 1830, blacks in Barbados had no notion that within 4 years' time they would be free, partially free, and that within 8 years' time they would be totally free. So let us look then at the road to freedom. The road to freedom for black enslaved people in Barbados did not start in this island. Unlike Jamaica and Haiti and Guyana, where you had slave uprisings, 1763 in Guyana, 1791 in Haiti, 1760 in Jamaica, 1831, etc. in Guyana, there were no such slave uprisings. In fact, there had been one in Barbados, 1816, about which we write a lot and we talk a lot, the so-called Bussa uprising or revolt in St. Philip, not only St. Philip but Christchurch and St. John and St. George, through which a number of elite enslaved persons, rangers, controllers, middle management enslaved, tried to overturn the established rule of the oligarchs, of the planters, by violent revolt, right, starting at Bailey's Plantation on Easter Monday morning, the 14th of April, 1816. That revolt lasted 3 days, and it was considered the major starting point on the road to freedom in Barbados. Starting point because the British government had to do a commission of inquiry looking into why did these enslaved persons rise up against their masters, who were supposed to be kind and hospitable and generous to them. Because the system of enslavement in Barbados was depicted as being something like heaven on earth, where blacks had everything they wanted by way of housing. They were provided with housing on the plantation. They had a little plot on which to grow what we would today call kitchen garden crops. They had a little yard in which to rear livestock, particularly pigs and fowls. And they worked for their masters. They did not get paid, but it was considered something next to heaven because they did not pay taxes. They didn't have responsibility as many of us householders do today, of paying daily, yearly taxes and seeing the cost of living go up. So they were considered to be in a state of bliss before they reached heaven. That was the face of it. Underneath that, of course, there was something different. Family life suffered because of trials and tribulations of slavery, and family life was almost destroyed because blacks, except for few reared by Moravians, could not get married. So the notion of a family, a nuclear family, in which father looks after mother, after children, that was only a geographical expression in Barbados because it was a stud farm. Adult males were utilized to breed adult females and semi-adult females, and there was no notion of the father having control over his family and rearing them according to Christian and other values. It was more or less a Wild West situation. Family life among blacks was still far off. By that I mean normal family life. People were considered just energy converters on the plantations, and their bodies belonged to the planters. The planters could rape and otherwise assault females, and several brown-skinned persons grew out of such forced liaisons. And families could not carry out their religious beliefs and practices. Animism, which we today call opium, was taboo, prohibited on the plantations. Some enslaved persons were Muslim. A great deal is made of this today. We do not know to what degree there was a Muslim community among the enslaved. And some had been converted to Christianity through the dedicated work of Methodists and Moravians. These were few. Most lived on plantations in which the planter had sons, one of whom inherited the plantation, the second one became an attorney, and the third one became a priest. So the blacks were hemmed in by the plantation, by the law, and by the Christian religion, particularly the Anglican Church. In fact, it is said that the Anglican Church was a planter class at prayer. It was a backward church grouping. It did not accept that blacks had human qualities. It projected the notion that blacks coming from Africa were quote-unquote heathen and pagans, and that they were sons of Satan, and they had to be treated as such. They were not eligible for the sacraments of the Christian church, which christening, baptism, confirmation classes, confirmation, holy sacrament, communion, marriage was vetoed, and of course extreme unction at the point of death and Christian burial. The enslaved people had to bury their own people in particular plots. They were not allowed to bury their people in the parish churchyards. They were not Christians. They were not human beings. And that is why we have at Newton today a large grouping of slave burial plots where at least 450 former enslaved people were buried on the Newton plantation in Christchurch. So families were regularly split. Enslaved people were transferred from the north of the island to the center, to the south, and always their practices, such as their herbal treatments and their system of rearing their children, they were attacked by the oligarchic planters. Right? But still they persisted, but they had no hope, as we said, by 1830, of being emancipated. Emancipation means to be set free, or being made human beings according to the law. The law did not regard them as human beings, but as semi-savages, because Africa, from which they came, was supposed to be a dark continent full of persons with grotesque shapes. Of course, Africa had small dwarf-like persons who were called pygmies. But that is just one of the extremities of which Africa was suspected of harboring. Semi-animals, etc. So the African in Barbados and throughout the Caribbean was supposed to have been raised in the scale of humanity by being brought across 3,200 miles from Africa, across the Middle Passage, and anchored in Barbados. There were no semi-savages. In Africa, there were total savages. And it was considered, it was featured, and it was figured that they would have to wait another 1,000 years before they could reach the level of the white person in Barbados and throughout the region. So there was no hope for them. Did I say no hope? Well, at least by 1824-25, some hope, a glimmer of hope, arose for them in the form of a man called William Hart Coleridge. a member of the Anglican Church of London, and sent out by the Archbishop of Canterbury to be Bishop of Barbados. Bishop Coleridge, 1824 to 1842, tried his best to prepare the African for freedom. And if we say that the road to freedom began in 1816 with the Buster Rebellion, violent confrontation, a softer branch or tributary of that road to freedom began with Bishop Coleridge in 1825, when he began a program of building churches, chapels of ease. He began a program of allowing blacks to come into the churches. Yes, come into churches and sit, not in the back rows as everybody says, but in the balconies, the upstairs segment of our parish churches. Why? Because the blacks were considered to be criminally minded and to be looking for opportunities to revolt and kill their masters. So even though they were allowed to attend church services in the Anglican Church, they had to be controlled. So they were placed upstairs in the balconies, so that if they started a revolt or some kind of antisocial behavior, they had to come downstairs, and the planters would greet them with rifles and whips, etc. Still, Bishop Coleridge continued his path until 1842, when he died and left here, and he built a number of chapels. We can see in St. Michael's, St. Barnabas, St. Paul's, All Saints, St. Stephen's, and the list goes on. In my own parish of St. John, there is Holy Cross, there is St. Margaret's, there is St. Gabriel, St. Raphael, St. Margaret's. And throughout Barbados, you had these chapels of ease, which allowed blacks to go to church and to learn a number of things. One, they learned the catechism, they learned to read, they learned to write, they learned the gospel. Although the gospel told them, according to St. Paul, servants, be obedient to those who are put in authority over you. So they were being conditioned to remain in an enslaved condition. They were still encased in what Robert Nesta Marley called mental slavery, from which they were never to be emancipated. There were other areas in which the enslaved were being prepared on the road to freedom. We had on some plantations the emergence of a number of female-headed or dominated families. The best example of which is at Old Doll on Newton Plantation, in which the matriarchs fought the oligarchs. Black matriarchs, by negotiation, by what is called feminine wiles, by using their sexuality, and by playing all common sense and being able to carry out, to execute their tasks efficiently and with a minimum of fuss, they gained the confidence of the planters, and they were able to procure for themselves and their families a reasonable standard of living on the plantations. And as in the case of Old Doll, this went from one generation to another, so that by the 1830s, some enslaved people were living pretty. If you were light-skinned, you were a maid, a lady's maid on the plantation. You were able to wear cast-off clothing from the missus, and you were treated as though you were a member of the family. You were not a field nigger. You were a house slave. And therefore you were closer to the planter and his family in manners, mannerisms, education, etc. And not surprisingly, you found a number of persons like Samuel Jackman Prescott, Prescott, born in 1806, and by the 1820s, Prescott, a light-skinned person. And remember that Barbadian society was graded according to skin complexion. And Prescott was able to agitate for people looking like him who were called the free coloreds. He had education, he had people who looked out for him as a free colored, and he was able to agitate for the freedom, the partial freedom of persons. So remember, the road to freedom has this small step. The agitation which resulted in the revolt at Belize, the agitation of the missionaries, Moravians and Methodists, the introduction of far-seeing progressive Bishop Coleridge, the political activism of a person such as Samuel J. Prescott, and to a lesser extent, the activism of a woman called Sarah Ann Gill, she, like Prescott, being a woman of color. And remember, color was second only to class, that is, planters, colored persons, and then blacks in Barbadian society. So the road to freedom had these particular staging points, right? And particularly the 1816 rebellion is seen as the major staging point, but we do not think that it's so, because persons who had revolted were repressed. Over 500 of them died, perhaps 700 more were incarcerated, some were sent to Honduras, some were sent back to Africa, and that was snuffed out. Right? But there were still some messages and some lessons which came out of the 1816 rebellion. For one thing, it was established that the enslaved people were not docile, were not totally docile, right? They were not cowards, right? And they were ready, like the people in Ukraine, to strike a blow for freedom, to strike a blow against their oppressors. And because they were up in the upper level of enslaved persons, they had time to conspire and to stage a revolt and to harangue the other persons and as leaders to lead them into battle. And this was a great fear on the part of the oligarchs, the planters, that you would have a group of trusted enslaved persons, field rangers, Buster, Jackie, Cain Davis, John Richard Sargent, and Nanny Gregg, that these persons who had influential positions on the plantation, that these would rise up in opposition to the planters when they should be in a situation of gratitude, that they would turn ungrateful, as the planters argued, and that they would lead the field niggers to full-fledged rebellion and regime change in Barbados, to overthrow the whites and to place blacks in control of the society. And we must look at that very seriously. That was always a fear of the planters, that the niggers would rise up against them. Now, I have to use the term niggers because it is a historical term. Nowadays, we would say people of color or blacks or Africans, but according to the wording in the documents which we historians study, the word Africa is only utilized when you're saying a good crop of persons has just arrived from Africa. The literature, the correspondence never says Africans, they said Negroes. And although there was no Negro land, that was the term utilized for persons of African descent, and it has persisted down to our day. So when you hear me utilize the term Negro or nigger, it is not that I am indulging in derogation of the African race in Barbados. I am using a term which was historically accurate, which was historically and legally appropriate. Until the late 20th century, people of African descent were called Negroes or Negros or niggers. And you can see that on the that term on some of the advertisements. Arrived from Guinea, a boatload, a shipload of prime niggers, right, etc., etc. So have that behind us. Let us proceed. We are looking at the question of the road to freedom. And we have so far looked at what was happening in Barbados. Freedom was a distant concept, even in the minds of Samuel J. Prescott, who established a newspaper called the New Times, and then the Liberal, and agitated for freedom of people. But he agitated for the freedom of persons who looked like himself, sort of looking like our Deputy Prime Minister Santia Bradshaw, that complexion, which they were called the Browns in Jamaica. In Barbados, they were called the Coloreds, or Free Coloreds, because most of them had been emancipated. And Prescott was able in 1832 to get a bill passed in House of Parliament, Barbados. He was instrumental, I wouldn't say he was able, but the Brown Privilege Bill was passed in Barbados 1832, and it gave to persons looking like Prescott and, well, we would say it like today's David Thompson and Santia Bradshaw, that type of coloring, gave them the right to hold property, to offer themselves as justices, to give evidence in court, and to pursue professions, what we call liberal professions, such as teaching and law, etc. There were no human beings. They were no longer niggers. They were not field niggers. They were semi-free persons. But that is as far as the Barbadian planters in Parliament were prepared to go. They thought that slavery, which had lasted from 1627 in this island, that it would continue until 1927 or 2027. They could not see that within 2 years the Abolition Act would be passed. And that brings us to another branch of the road to freedom. And this is the external branch of that road. Now, it has been a practice in today's historiography, that is study of history and the writing of history by Caribbean historians, to argue that slave revolts, such as the Haitian Revolution, the Sam Sharp Revolt of 1831-32, the Demerara Revolt, 1823, 1816, that these made the difference and caused the British to at least conclude that slavery should come to an end. Such historiography, such reading of the information tends to ignore or to reduce in importance the influence of the external, the English activism, the activism in Britain and in the British Parliament. I do not subscribe to that, because the work of a man like William Wilberforce from 1793 onwards until 1807, that work ensured the passage of the Act of Abolition of the Slave Trade of 1807, by which Britain disinvested in the slave trade. After 1808, Britain no longer encouraged or legitimized the bringing of Africans as enslaved persons in British ships to the Caribbean. Britain abolished the slave trade effective 1808. And that was the work of the Clapham sect of Wilberforce and Thomas Fowell Buxton and Granville Sharp and Clarkson, Fox, etc. We cannot deny their activism in the British Parliament. And we cannot deny that for the next decade. You're looking at 1807, you're looking at up to the Bussey Rebellion of 1816. There was agitation in the British Parliament about the abolition of slavery. It was a huge debate, continuous debate. Arguments were raised for the continuation of enslavement. It was argued that you were bringing black people from Africa, savages. Savages, they were called savages, uncivilized because of their color and features. You were exposing them to the glorious Western civilization and Christianity. And that process of making them civilized and non-savage could not be frustrated by abolition of slavery. It was argued that through slavery, they were being made into proper persons and Christians. That was argued, that slavery was the best system for persons of African descent, African features, and from the continent. Yes, that was argued. But alternatively, it was argued in Britain under the mantra, am I not a man and a brother? Humanitarianism, liberté, égalité, fraternité, the French Revolutionary, the watchwords of the French Revolution. Liberté, freedom, égalité, equality, right? Right? Fraternité, brotherhood, the brotherhood of man, according to which notion no person should be made a slave of another. Right? The Russians have not learned that notion over the past centuries up to today. And they are trying to enslave Ukrainians, jerk them back into a time when mankind dominated mankind. Right. So it was in the Caribbean, and Wilberforce and his friends, the Clapham sect, turned their attention to the abolition of slavery as an institution. They argued that it was economically a poor system in that the planter, the oligarch, had to look after all the needs of the enslaved person, from jackboot to slipper, had to look after their medicinal and other requirements, food, etc., because they were not workers. They were energy converters. They were all products and property of the planter. He had to look after his plantation, his totality of 400 enslaved persons. And that was a burden. Right? And if you set free the persons, then they become wage workers. They earn wages, and they utilize the wages to fill their bodily and creature wants and to make themselves happy by improving their household stock, etc. That was argued. But people could not see that. People in Britain, they fought tooth and nail against the notion of emancipation and freedom. And I think that at the back of all of that argumentation lay the core concept. If you allow black people to be free, they will engage in revenge. They will slaughter the whites. This is what was called a terrified consciousness, that the whites always felt. They knew that they had enslaved and brutalized blacks, and they felt that for every action, not only in physics but in life, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And they felt that if you emancipated the blacks, that they would rise up and slaughter them in their beds. So that notion of revenge kept this West India grouping, the planters in Britain, it kept them vibrant and active. But slowly in the 1820s, the notion grew that slavery in the Caribbean, in Barbados, was no longer efficient economically, and that it did not procure safety and security for the planters. In fact, it pushed the enslaved people to extremes of behavior, and that conflagration and volcanic eruption would occur. And so it happened 1831-32 in Jamaica. Sam Sharp's rebellion, the Baptist War, called the Baptist War because it was supposed to be fomented by Baptist missionaries. But it started in December, Christmas rebellion, and lasted until February. And 1/3 of Jamaica went up in flames. Sam Sharp was hanged. Yes, he's now a national hero in Jamaica. But the British understood this is the last straw that breaks the camel's back. If we continue with the enslavement of people from Jamaica and British Honduras right through to British Guyana, we are going to have many more of these eruptions. And so in 1833, Wilberforce was able to bring to Parliament the bill for the abolition of slavery. It was passed in May 1833 to come into effect from the 1st of August 1834 for our children 6 years and under, and for the old people, looking like myself, and that the prideal slaves, those agricultural slaves who cut sugarcane to bond their hand, they would continue under a system of apprenticeship until 1840, and the house slaves, the brown-skinned ones, and the artisan slaves, the carpenters, masons, coopers, etc., will be emancipated in 1838. A rather convoluted system, just showing you that the British felt that you could not emancipate people straight away. You had to hold on to them and look at the system which was introduced. The apprenticeship. By that, it meant that you were apprenticing them, you were training them to be continuing workers on the plantations. In America, the shareholders, that was the name given to the system, by which blacks, after emancipation, remained on the plantations, and they leased land from their planters, but they had to produce money from their crops, right, and sell to the same planters in order to offset the debts. And they never got rid of those debts. So crop shareholders, they shared the expenses of the economy, but they did not share the benefits. They remained poor. So the notion was that black people should remain poor. Under no circumstances should they offer competition to the whites on an economic level, nor on a social, educational level. Thus, education for them was put at primary level. From 1835, John Sterling put out a program of education which he said would keep them in subservience for the next 2 generations, and he would fill the curriculum with a lot of spiritual incantations and exhortations, establishing the point that if you are black, the education to which you are entitled is only of primary or elementary. You're not supposed to advance to the 2 main schools for boys in this island, Harrison's Free School, which became Harrison College in the 1870s, or the Lodge School, a product of Codrington College. No notion of girls' education came into the calculations. Black people were not supposed to challenge their masters, the oligarchs, the whites. And as a matter of fact, blacks were not even supposed to challenge the Red Lake community. The Red Lake community, Redlegs were initially indentured servants who worked on the plantations before slavery, before African slavery. And after completion of their indentureship, those who survived ended up on the poorest land, from St. Lucie, St. Andrew, St. Peter, St. Joseph, particularly St. John and St. Philip. And because of this, they were considered lower class, whites, backward Johnnies. They moved from being indentured servants to poor or humble whites. Some occupied urban districts in Bridgetown, but the planter oligarchs made sure that rather than raise the blacks in the system of humanity and education, they raised the red legs. For example, the Alleyne School was established by Sir John Gay Alleyne for poor whites in the north. What is now Combermere School was established for poor whites. What is now Queen's College for poor white girls. And many other schools were given or were established. For example, the Haynes Memorial School in Bridgetown, which lasted to the end of the 20th century. And laws were passed allowing, or rather disallowing, any competition between the blacks and the poor whites. Poor whites filled roles in the local militia. They became craftsmen, herdsmen, carters, grooms, and they also were agricultural laborers. But the high whites always looked out for the working class whites, and they received an education. But despite that, blacks were still able to forge a path towards freedom. They established their own schools. They utilized the churches, the Christian churches coming from America, Christian mission, etc., who catered to the blacks, and as we said earlier, Moravians and Methodists. Blacks became hucksters, shopkeepers, etc. Some moved to Bridgetown to become small-scale operators. So the road to freedom is not just a matter of emancipating people from legally from slavery, and this was done by 1833, came into being the 1st of August 1838. It's not just that, but a whole generation had to be enfranchised. As Lord Harris, the governor of Trinidad, said, a race has been freed, but a society has not been formed. We now had to form a society. We now had to make former slaves free persons, give them education, give them opportunities for jobs, give them opportunities to pursue different professions than just agricultural laborer, cutting sugar cane till it burned your hand. Unfortunately, this did not happen. Unfortunately, the freedom of which we spoke was freedom against, but not freedom for. Thus, by 1838, blacks in Barbados had a form of freedom in which they were no longer whipped or forced to labor. As the folk song said, lick and lock up, done with, hurrah for Gin Gin. But they were not allowed to celebrate freedom. Let me explain. They celebrated the 1st of August. But do you know how they celebrated it? It was considered a holiday, a simple holiday. Throughout the rest of the Caribbean, the 1st of August was considered Emancipation Day. And this historian looked through all of the almanacs in the various Caribbean territories regarding the 1st of August. Grenada, Emancipation Day. Jamaica, Emancipation Day. Trinidad. When you come to Barbados, it is August public holiday. It was not until 2008 when the Barbadian Prime Minister, the late Mr. Owen Arthur, said, it is Emancipation Day. We have not been celebrating Emancipation Day as Emancipation Day. We've been celebrating it as August bank holiday. A bank holiday without a public holiday, without rhyme or reason. Just to show you how backward Barbados was, right? We were not told that it was Emancipation Day. And indeed, the people on the plantations remained in semi-slavery for another 100 years until the 1930s. Some historians argue that the 1930s riots represent the culmination of the road to freedom. But we must say that whether you accept that or not, the legal situation is that by 1833 May, the Act of Abolition was passed in Britain and it became law throughout the Caribbean territories. In Antigua, blacks were freed immediately from the next year, August 1834. They did not go through apprenticeship. In all the other territories, it was felt that blacks were recalcitrant, which meant that they were rambunctious or troublemakers, so you had to keep them in subjection for another 4 years. So it is only from the 1st of August 1838 that we find that all other blacks, or Negroes, or niggers, become free from the whip and from the oppressive laws. And even then, you cannot call it full freedom because child labor continued from the 1830s until the 1950s. This person here saw children undergoing child labor, went on his way to Lord School in the 1960s. We saw people being forced to work under conditions which were appalling, right, and primitive. People working in the fields without any shelter and without any toilet facilities. Right. We saw people being made to go to work age 7 and having no childhood, no teenagerhood, and having just birth, toddler status, and then work. So many people in the society. And some argue that the road to freedom is still being traveled by blacks in Barbados, that we have not controlled the commanding heights of the economy, that the oligarchs still control the plantations and the other forms of developing money and profits in this society. But the historical fact is that in May 1833, the road to freedom culminated in the Act of Parliament in Britain, which said that henceforth persons were free. And by 1834, some 83,807 persons, as Sir Lionel Smith said, lay down the night before the 31st of July, and they woke up on the 1st of August as free persons. By 1838, that number was 84,000 by natural increase. So the work then of making Barbados a truly free society began on the 1st of August, 1838. And it is for that reason that we celebrate the 1st of August, 1838. Up to now, we celebrate it. It has become caught up in the spectacle of our masquerade street fair Kadooment. But nonetheless, it is celebrated because Africans did celebrate the passages of their lives by street parties. Crop over was celebrated on the plantations during slavery. And we have a reenactment of crop over as a folk festival, not on individual plantations now, but for the entire society. So we are not, as someone would say, reviling or desecrating the 1st of August when we engage in the masquerade and jump up of crop over. We're just celebrating, as Africans on the continent have done, as Africans have done in Brazil, as Africans have done in New Orleans. We're just celebrating the glorious fact of being alive and not being slaves. Thank you.